Welcome to Yellowstone Story. Every story holds a lesson, a twist, or a spark of inspiration. Here, we dive into gripping tales, some heartwarming, some shocking, but all unforgettable. So sit back, relax, and let's begin. I had just started my shift when an ambulance pulled up to the morgue, followed by an entire wedding procession. All my colleagues rushed outside. Seeing a wedding arrive at a morgue was a rare sight. It was shift change time, so a lot of people had gathered. I stepped aside, not wanting to attract attention. I had only been working here for a short time, barely knew anyone, and had no intention of making acquaintances. People around me understood where I had come from, but no one spoke about it openly. I had recently been released from prison. No one really asked what I had served time for, but everyone knew I had been an inmate. I simply mopped the floors, and that was enough for them to tolerate me. In their eyes, it was better than me returning to crime. However, theft was not the reason for my imprisonment. I had nearly killed my own husband. I had been married for only a year, but by the second day of my wedding, I realized I had tied my life to a monster. He had hidden his true nature for a long time, but eventually it fully revealed itself. For a year, I lived in hell. He abused me, and there was no one to stand up for me. I had grown up in an orphanage, with no family to protect me. I endured it for as long as I could, but at some point, my nerves gave out. When he raised his hand against me once again, I grabbed a wine bottle and struck him on the head. He spent 2 months in the hospital. His family was powerful and well-connected, and they demanded the harshest punishment for me. But the judge, an elderly woman, saw the situation differently. She said that people like me shouldn't be imprisoned but thanked instead, as this was a way of cleansing the world. I was sentenced to 4 years, but after 3, I was released on parole. Life on the outside turned out to be just as difficult. No one wanted to hire me. While walking past the morgue one day, I noticed a job posting for an orderly. The salary was higher than I had expected, but I had little hope of being accepted. Still, I told my story honestly, preparing for yet another rejection, but unexpectedly, I was given a chance. The job was tough. In the first few days, I felt fear. I couldn't get used to the dead bodies, the silence, the smell. But the head pathologist, Mr. Andrews, once noticed my tension and, smirking, told me that it was the living I should be afraid of, not those who could no longer do anything. His words stayed with me, and after a few shifts, I stopped flinching at every accidental touch. An ambulance arrived, and paramedics carried out a stretcher. A young woman lay on it, still dressed in her wedding gown. Next to her stood her groom. His face was empty, lost. He seemed to see nothing and hear no one. His eyes were fixed only on her. Relatives tried to pull him away, but he wouldn't let go, desperately clinging to her cold hand. In the end, they had to drag him away by force, yet he kept crying, his voice breaking into a scream. Later, I overheard the orderlies talking. It turned out that the bride had been poisoned by her own friend, right at the wedding. The groom had once been in a relationship with this woman, but then he met his future wife and fell in love with her. The abandoned ex couldn't forgive him. Now she had been arrested. But that didn't change anything. The bride was gone. As I walked past the stretcher, I stopped for a moment. Her face was unbelievably beautiful, peaceful, as if she were simply asleep. Mr. Andrews reminded me to finish cleaning and close the room. He looked tired and was in a hurry. When I asked if the autopsy would be performed today, he just shook his head. He had urgent matters to attend to, and as he put it, the dead could wait. I wondered if working among them made people more philosophical. When the floors were cleaned and the rooms were locked, I stepped outside. The night air was fresh, and I lingered for a moment at the entrance before noticing a lone figure sitting on a bench nearby. In the fading light, I recognized him. The groom. He sat motionless, staring toward the morgue. His lifeless gaze unsettled me, but I pushed aside my hesitation and walked closer. Softly, I asked if there was anything I could do to help. Slowly, he lifted his head and focused his eyes on me. He was silent for a long time before finally giving a slight nod. His voice was hollow when he asked if I could take him to her. I answered honestly I couldn't. It would cost me my job, and I had nowhere else to go. He nodded indifferently, as if he had expected that response. Then, after a pause, he asked why no one would hire me. His voice sounded as if he was speaking just to break the silence, as if any conversation was better than the emptiness. I looked at him and, hoping to distract him from his heavy thoughts, admitted the truth. I had recently been released from prison, having served time for killing my husband. He nodded again, showing no reaction. It seemed like nothing could surprise him anymore. After a brief silence, he asked if the autopsy had already been performed. I told him it was scheduled for tomorrow. He let out a slow breath, as if making a final decision, then quietly said that he would stay here. He would bury her, and then. I was tense. His words were terrifying to hear. I tried to reason with him, to tell him that he couldn't think like that life didn't end even in moments like these, but he only gave me a distant look and said it was already decided. His gaze dimmed again, his posture closing off. He had no intention of continuing the conversation. I realized that I wouldn't be able to change his mind. He had already made his decision, and no words could undo it. The only thing I could do was inform his family. They were supposed to come for the bride's body, and maybe they would be able to stop him. Before going back to work, I glanced at him once more. He was still sitting there, motionless, staring at the morgue. I felt a deep sense of pity for him. I returned inside and resumed cleaning. At one point, as I passed by the bride's body, I noticed something strange. Her face looked unusually fresh, too alive for someone who had been dead for several hours. I hesitated, wondering if the poison could have caused this. But as I looked closer, an uneasy feeling crept over me. Cautiously, almost hesitantly, I reached out to straighten her hand. The moment my fingers touched her skin, I recoiled. Her hand was warm and soft. That was impossible in such a cold room. My heartbeat quickened. I reached out again, pressing my fingertips against her skin, hoping I had imagined it. But no. She was warm. A wave of anxiety washed over me. If she was alive, every second mattered. I rushed to my bag, my mind racing for a way to confirm my suspicion. Then I remembered. Breath leaves a mark on a mirror. Fumbling through my bag, I found a small mirror and hurried back, nearly colliding with one of the orderlies in my haste. He looked at me in surprise. "What's going on?" It was Liam, a medical student who often worked shifts here. Everyone respected him for his intelligence and composure. I was breathing heavily, but there was no time to explain. "Liam, come with me, now," I gasped, grabbing his arm. I ran to the bride's body, my hands trembling as I pulled out the mirror. Liam stood beside me, watching my movements with growing confusion. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Ignoring him, I carefully held the mirror to her lips. A second passed. Then faintly, a mist appeared on the glass. I froze, staring at the faint mist on the mirror, but Liam reacted instantly. He jumped up, his voice sharp with urgency, demanding that I call Mr. Andrews immediately. My fingers trembled as I dialed the number. Meanwhile, Liam had already placed his stethoscope against the bride's chest, concentrating as he listened. As I struggled to explain to Mr. Andrews what was happening, Liam suddenly lifted his head. "Her heart is beating, weak, but it's there. She's alive. I'm calling an ambulance," he said. I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted for the door, sprinting into the cold night. The groom was still sitting motionless, lost in his thoughts, unaware of the world around him. I barely felt the chill as I ran up to him. "Your bride is alive," I said. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were filled with disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend what he had just heard. But at that very moment, the sharp wail of sirens cut through the night air, and an ambulance screeched to a stop in front of the morgue. He grabbed my hand, his fingers trembling. His eyes, overflowing with pain and desperate hope, locked onto mine. "You're not lying?" I shook my head. "I don't know how, but she's alive." He needed no further explanation. In the next instant, he sprang to his feet and ran toward the morgue doors. At the same time, the orderlies emerged, carrying the stretcher. The bride was still motionless, but now medical staff swarmed around her. One of the doctors was holding an IV, preparing for emergency transport. The groom didn't hesitate. "I'm going with you," he called out. The doctor shot him a stern look, but the groom didn't back down. "I'm her husband. Today was our wedding." The medic gave a brief nod. "Get in, quickly. Every minute counts." The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the vehicle sped off into the night, sirens blaring, disappearing down the dark road. I remained standing outside the morgue, Liam beside me. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there, silently watching it vanish into the distance. Liam looked at me and quietly said that today I had saved a life. The doctor had mentioned that if it hadn't been for the cold, the bride wouldn't have survived. The poison was unusual, but the low temperature had slowed its effects, giving her a chance to be rescued. I wiped away the tears that had welled up in my eyes and whispered, "A life for a life." I took one, and I saved one. Liam heard me but only smiled. "How about some tea?" Not the most pleasant place, but still. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Outside." We walked toward the same bench where the groom had been sitting not long ago. I glanced at Liam. Up close, he looked older than I had initially thought. His glasses gave him the appearance of a young student, but as we talked, different details surfaced. After serving in the army, he had stayed on contract at a military hospital, which eventually led him to medicine. Now it made sense why he was always so composed, even in the most tense situations. Liam spoke thoughtfully, saying that he had seen doctors work under pressure and knew how easy it was to make mistakes, even in critical moments. But despite that, they were the ones who performed real miracles, especially in places where no one expected them to. After a brief pause, he cautiously asked about my past. I hesitated for a moment but eventually told him my story. He listened intently, never interrupting. When I finished, he simply stated that I shouldn't torment myself over it. His reaction caught me off guard. Until now, no one had ever looked at me as a victim. I wasn't used to hearing words of understanding instead of judgment. We hadn't even finished our tea when a car pulled up near the morgue. Mr. Andrews stepped out, spotted us on the bench, and, with his usual irony, asked if we had made ourselves a little too comfortable. Liam tapped his fingers thoughtfully on his knee, thinking out loud. He had never encountered anything like this before. A friend of the bride had switched the poison for an extremely strong sedative. The dose had been critical, making her breathing almost undetectable. A little more, and she wouldn't have survived. Mr. Andrews let out a tired sigh, acknowledging that it was a good thing he had decided to postpone the autopsy. I stared at him in amazement, realizing just how thin the line between life and death really was. I never would have thought something like this was possible. The next morning, I stepped out of the morgue, heading toward the bus stop. As I reached it, a car pulled up beside me. Liam rolled down the window, looked at me, and offered me a ride. I froze in place, not immediately understanding why he had offered. Everyone else tried to keep their distance from me, but he didn't. Turning slightly, I noticed the orderlies standing by the morgue entrance, watching us while smoking and whispering among themselves. Liam glanced in the rearview mirror and smirked, as if reading my thoughts. Then, in a calm voice, he told me that their opinions shouldn't matter to me. I hesitated, but in the end, I got into the car. That was how our rides together started. A couple of weeks later, he suddenly suggested going to the movies or a cafe. I shook my head, unsure of what to say. He looked surprised and asked why. Staring out the window, trying to conceal my unease, I quietly admitted that I didn't understand why he would want that. He knew who I was. Liam didn't back down. He simply stated that he wasn't without sins himself, that he had fought in a war, had pulled the trigger, and, unlike me, not out of necessity. There was no judgment in his voice, only the quiet certainty that a person's past didn't have to define them forever. That evening, as I was cleaning the corridor, I caught myself feeling unexpectedly lighter. I hadn't given him an answer, but deep down I realized how much I wanted to say yes. I wanted to live like everyone else, not feel like an outcast forever. From the break room, irritated voices drifted into the hallway. Someone was mocking Liam loudly, questioning why he was bothering and whether he was just playing a game. They reminded him that I had been in prison, openly wondering why he would want to get involved with someone like me. Liam responded calmly but firmly. It was his decision, and it was no one else's business. But the taunts didn't stop. A minute later, he stepped into the hallway, his fist clenched. His voice carried an unmistakable warning. One more word about me, and someone might end up on the cold morgue table themselves. One of the orderlies backed off, muttering that everyone here was insane. I stood in silence, watching him. Liam turned to me, grasped my arm with firm determination, and led me away, making it clear that this conversation was over. There was no hesitation in his eyes when he said this couldn't go on like this. He genuinely liked me, and it was time to do something about it. I stared at Liam, unsure of what to say, when suddenly someone nearby cheerfully remarked that the answer was obvious. We needed to get married, and the wedding would be spectacular. I froze, struggling to process whether they were serious. Laughter erupted around us, but I couldn't tell if it was friendly or mocking. Liam simply smirked, as if he wasn't the least bit surprised by the suggestion. Meanwhile, something inside me shifted. The thought seemed impossible, yet unexpectedly, it filled me with warmth. The next day, unexpected visitors arrived at the morgue. I was busy cleaning when I heard familiar voices. Turning around, I saw the groom and his bride, the very woman we had saved. She looked much better now, though she was still a little pale. They held hands tightly, as if afraid to let go of each other. Liam stepped out of his office and stopped when he saw them. The newlyweds approached, and the groom, smiling, said they couldn't just leave without seeing us. They felt they owed us their lives. His bride looked at me, then at Liam, gratitude shining in her eyes. Then she said they had a gift for us. They pulled out an envelope and handed it to Liam. He took it with a puzzled expression, and when he opened it, I caught a glimpse of the contents, plane tickets. We couldn't think of a better gift, the groom said. You saved our lives, and now we want to give you the chance to start your own. These are tickets to Goa. I froze, unable to believe what I was seeing. Goa. I had never been to the sea, never even imagined that I would ever see something like that. Liam looked at me, then back at the tickets. This is too much, he finally said. But the newlyweds simply shook their heads. For them, this was a gesture of gratitude, one they had to make. A warmth spread through me, filling every part of my being. For the first time in a long time, I realized that I didn't have to just exist. I could live.